This is a sort of follow-on to my previous ramble on King Arthur, and will follow much of the same format. That is, two videos, the first exploring the subject matter at hand, the second delving into gaming aspects. As the title suggests, the subject matter is that of that other great English tradition, Robin Hood, outlaw of the forests, advocate for the common man, and rebel against the establishment. Or, on the other side of the coin, an elusive bandit who had a penchant for stealing from church and state. Either way, let me start by saying what this video is not going to be. As with Arthur, we have no idea who Robin Hood actually was, or if he even existed. So this video is not going to wander down rabbit holes in an attempt to reach a conclusion on either of those points. We'll have a bit of an exploration about historical figures on record that may have, in one way or another, influenced the Robin myths and legends. But beyond that, the Robin that we will explore in the main is one of exactly that: myth and legend, and of literature and of film. From what we know of Robin, he is even more of a figure of story than Arthur. With Arthur, we have sources from historians of one stripe or another, including figures such as Nennius and Gildas and Bede. For Robin, our earliest sources are from medieval ballad. He is mentioned in Vicio Villame de Petro Ploughman, William's Visions of Pierre's Ploughman, or more commonly, simply Pierre's Ploughman. This 14th century narrative poem provides the earliest known reference to Robin Hood. In Passus 5, a statement is made: "I do not know my paternoster, as the priest sings it, but I do know rhymes of Robin Hood and Randolph, Earl of Chester." This in relation to seeking penance, and the speaker here is referring to the Lord's Prayer. The paternoster is the priest sings it. Ranulph de Blondeville, the 6th Earl of Chester, a late 12th century historical figure contemporary to King John, and a witness to the signing of the Magna Carta, and among other feats. One of the foundational works of the Robin Hood mythology is the 16th century, A Little Jest of Robin Hood. No mere mention of Robin here, but complete adventures. The work begins with Robin, Little John, and Will Scarlock, who will later become Will Scarlet, encountering a knight. Offering the knight hospitality, Robin begins a chain of events that lead up to Little John into serving the knight as a yeoman, Robin helping the knight to pay off his debts, and the knight serving to pay Robin back over a period of time. During this, Little John displays his expertise with the bow, gets drafted into the Sheriff of Nottingham's service, and the theft of the sheriff's silverware. The sheriff is later invited, and I use that term loosely, to dine with the outlaw band from his own silverware, and is released from his invitation only after swearing to leave Robin's band alone. After that, Robin hijacks a monk, enters an archery contest held by the sheriff for a trophy of an arrow made with a silver shaft and a gold head and fletchings, is taken by his friend the knight and besieged by the sheriff, meets and is granted mercy by the king, and eventually meets his end by being slowly bled to death by the prioress of Kirkley while seeking healing at that priory. We can have some fun with the jest here. For a start, the king it mentions is Edward, which Edward is not stated, but if we couple the ballad with Pierre's Ploughman, it must be one of the first three: Edward Longshanks, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, Edward II from 1307 to 1327, and Edward III from 1327 to 1377. Assuming that Pierre's Ploughman was actually written in the 1370s, Edward III would have been the current monarch, which would either make him the most likely candidate, being the king that is contemporary to the earlier mention, or least, given that the mention of Ranulph in the same context gives it a pre-Edward's flavour, planting it within the reign of John, who was king from 1199 to 1216. Now, the jest makes a central antagonist of the Sheriff of Nottingham, which throws a bit of a spanner into the works here. The sheriff would have been contemporary to the jest, but not to those older poems. There was no Sheriff of Nottingham until 1449, So it is more likely that the author of the jest introduced more modern references to the tales that he was reforging to give his audience a level of familiarity. I suspect those audiences would have, much as pretty much every English person does today, a cultural understanding of Robin Hood's tales, who the mentioned Edward was, if it was even felt relevant, and that the villain of the piece was being anachronistic. Well, they probably didn't care. We can sort of see this reimagining and reworking in real time today with characters such as the Avengers, Batman and the X-Men and so on, as their stories in comics are constantly revised to meet the needs of the current audience, and their adventures are revised to suit the storytelling needs of the movies. While no cinema screens existed back in the 13th to 17th centuries, when much of the Robin Hood world building was being done, the process of revision is much the same, and of course, continues to this day with respect to Robin himself. Within the jest, we also see figures such as Little John and Will Scarlet established. Other central characters of the legend, such as Friar Tuck and Maid Marian, were added a little later. Marian is especially interesting in this regard. She appears as a figure within May festivities, part of the reason the month of May still possesses 2 public holiday days in England, as a May Queen or similar. At some point, a Robin character, but not our friendly outlaw, was also introduced into these festivities, eventually becoming associated with Marian. With tales of Robin Hood remaining popular, it was perhaps inevitable that the May Robin and Marian became tied to the outlaw character, and even after Marian's association with May had ended, we English still have some weird traditions for celebrating, especially May Day, but Marian is rarely ever brought into them these days. Her legacy as part of the growing outlaw mythology has remained. Her introduction occurred somewhere around the 16th century, post-dating the jest. With our main cast now assembled, we can take a closer look at the when of it all. The jest hints at an Edward, but where we are today generally places Robin within the reigns of Richard I and John, around 1189 to 1216. This, as much as anything Robin-related, is down to the development of the story over the centuries. Working from earlier sources, Anthony Munday wrote 2 plays around 1598, The Downfall of Robert Earl of Huntingdon and The Death of Robert Earl of Huntingdon. These describe Robin as the eponymous and displaced Earl of Huntingdon after a description laid down by Richard Grafton in 1569. And set the tales within the reign of Richard I, the information in the history of a Greater Britain, a 1571 work by John Major. Later works, up to the modern day, would adopt or ignore the Earl and Huntingdon connections, but the date stuck. As for location, the jest places Robin in Yorkshire, Barnsdale Forest, a region crossing between the West and the South Ridings. With the developments of the time, placement of the tales, the location likewise shifted and took advantage of real historical events. Richard I was mostly an absentee monarch, spending most of his adulthood within the Duchy of Aquitaine, a large chunk of what is now southwest France that, at the time, was under the control of England, or on crusade in the Middle East. Within the 1190s, the opportunity arose for John, Richard's younger brother, to take control of England, and this lasted until 1194, when Richard brought his forces to Nottingham and forced John to surrender. This lasted until 1194, when Richard brought his forces to Nottingham and forced John to surrender England back to the king. During the period, John wasn't exactly the best ruler that the kingdom could have had, but he wasn't much better under Richard. During Richard's reign, it's estimated that he spent around 6 months in total in England and raised ruinous taxes in order to fund the Crusades and wars. Regardless of the period of John's control, ahead of his actual rule that started from 1199 following Richard's death, and the subsequent restoration of the rightful monarch, all got written into Robin's tales. From generous outlaws to displaced earl to defenders of the rightful king against usurping tyrants, this naturally led to Robin's core hangout being moved from Barnsdale to Sherwood Forest, right on the doorstep of Nottingham itself, and within the jurisdiction of that other figure from the jest, the anachronistically placed sheriff. A couple of missing pieces before we move into more modern times. A short 17th century manuscript of unknown authorship exists within the collection of Hans Sloane, within the British Library. This manuscript is known as The Life of Robin Hood and retells some of the jest in prose form. It appears to draw from John Major, giving us that Richard I context over the jest's original Edward of one stripe or another, and provides a birthplace for this particular interpretation, Locksley, a village that either never was, or ceased to be, or is now a suburb of the city of Sheffield. The latter supposition is reinforced by the fact that the forest of Locksley Chase, that once surrounded the village, extended southwards to link up with Sherwood Forest, and John Harrison's exact and perfect survey and view of the manor of Sheffield from 1637 states, "Little Haggas Croft, wherein the foundation of a house or cottage where Robin Hood was born." And so, by 1795, with the publication of Robin Hood by Joseph Ritson, our hero has taken shape. We knew who he was, who his friends were, who his enemies were, where he was born, where he died, and the sort of things that he got up to in riding around the mighty Sherwood Forest. I'll pause in our exploration of Robin himself, ahead of diving into more modern interpretations, to speak a little of the mighty Sherwood itself, as much a character of the Robin Hood stories as Little John, the Sheriff of Nottingham, and even Robin himself. Sherwood today is under 1/20th of the size it was back in the supposed days of Robin Hood, when it covered about a quarter of Nottinghamshire, about 30 square miles or 77 square kilometres. That's a lot of space to hide bands of outlaws. William I assigned it as a royal hunting forest, and as such it became subject to forest laws, including those that Robin and some of his compatriots became fugitives for breaking, notably the preserve of sport hunting animals such as deer and boar. For those that think of a forest as a large swathe of woodland, let me change your minds. While forests do, by definition, have a large amount of their area covered with trees, their net composition is not entirely woodland. The area of Sherwood included a variety of types of terrain and encompassed the towns of Nottingham, Mansfield and Clipston, along with several smaller towns and villages. These days, the city of Nottingham and the town of Mansfield dominate the area, with the forest very much reduced. Within the area of Sherwood, ancient and modern, stand several landmarks from the Robin stories. Edwinstowe, where, in some tales, he married Marian. The Major Oak, where he allegedly hid or constructed the shelters for his merry men, and a number of locations named Robin Hood's this and Robin Hood's that. On this latter point, there are actually many Robin Hood this and that's across the entirety of England, including the steep fishing, fossil hunting and allegedly smuggling village of Robin Hood's Bay, wherein sit many noble second-hand bookshops, a gold mine for a lover of the printed word such as I, and probably the best purveyor of honeycomb ice cream in all of the sainted Yorkshire. Oh, and Dracula made landfall just along the coast at Whitby. Anyway, I digress. The point is, Sherwood is as important a name within the legendarium of Robin Hood as any, despite the oldest Robin Hood ballads having nothing to do with it, and as such is the figure of Robin cut into the English psyche that we will just name just about anything after him, whether he had anything to do with it or not. Joseph Ritson's 1795 work, Robin Hood, a collection of all the ancient poems, songs and ballads, now extant, relative to that celebrated outlaw, just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? Brought everything that the author could find together into one place. This gave purveyors of the written word a single go-to volume of source material about Robin, upon which to build their own works, and several followed. Ritson himself added to the Robin lore by adding copious notes to his work, giving Locksley as his birthplace, here stating it as a Nottinghamshire village that no longer stands, an approximate birth year of 1160, and a date of death of the 18th of November 1247. Given our English penchant for grabbing any vague date to burn something or imbibe copious quantities of alcohol, I'm surprised that we don't have a Robin Hood Day because of it. Anyway, we don't. More's the pity. Maybe I'll start one. Walter Scott was one of the early adopters of Ritson's work, using it as a basis for his depiction of Robin Hood in his 1819 novel, Ivanhoe. It's very good, and it further defined, refined and cemented some of the standard elements of the Robin Hood story that we know today. Others followed, including Piers Egan the Younger, who published a children's version of the Robin Hood story in 1840, that was later adapted into French in the 1870s by Alexandre Dumas, the son of the author of Musketeer Trio fame. Americans got in on the Robin Hood train with Howard Pyle's 1883, wait for it, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood of Great Renown in Nottinghamshire, who dragged the various sources kicking and screaming into a coherent narrative. Pyle's work is a sort of choke point, with all manner of sources feeding into it and all manner springing from it. In many ways, I liken him to the Geoffrey of Monmouth of Robin Hood lore, where Monmouth drew upon many sources for his depiction of Arthur, and then many drew upon Monmouth, including Mannering and White, for their depictions. I feel something similar happened with Pyle and Robin. Pyle didn't care about historicity. He wanted to make something of his Robin Hood figure that made sense, and that he did indeed. Pyle contains most of the common narrative that we know. Here, Robin is born within the reign of Henry II, enters an archery competition, accidentally kills a king's deer, and ends up on the run from the Sheriff of Nottingham. He assembles the Avengers of Sherwood, in a green-clad, non-metallic man sort of way, and proceeds to rob the rich to give to the poor. As in the jest, Little John enters the sheriff's service but leaves after missing his friends, stealing the sheriff's silverware. Robin returns the silverware on restating the outlaw's moral code. Arthur Bland, Will Scarlett, Much the Miller and Alan Adale join over a series of escapades, with Friar Tuck becoming an ally through Alan's romances. Not towards Tuck. That would have been a very different story. Note, Tuck presides over Alan's marriage to his love, Ellen. The poor knight of the jest is manifest here as Sir Richard of Lee, whom he helps and who becomes his ally. Henry II dies, Richard I succeeds him as king. After killing Guy of Gisborne, a lackey of the sheriff, Robin seeks out the sheriff, who has captured Little John. Little John is rescued. Richard I eventually asks Robin and his merry men to accompany him on his travels and his battles. After Richard's death and John's succession, Robin returns to Fort Sherwood. King John sets the sheriff onto Robin once more, ending in the sheriff's death. Wounded after this battle, Robin goes to his cousin, a nun, for help and healing. Instead of doing so, she opens a wound to Robin's heart. With one last blow of his horn, Robin summons Little John to his side, whereupon Little John helps his friend to shoot one last arrow, which then marks the site at which the outlaw hero is to be buried. Robin then dies in his friend's arms. The end. So you see, all there. All of the different tales and takes on Robin Hood that have played around with some details of the story, but that core has remained relatively consistent at the foundation. Errol Flynn starred in The Adventures of Robin Hood 55 years after Pyle's works, bringing our hero to the silver screen once more, following in the footsteps of Douglas Fairbanks in 1922, and a number of silent shorts. Walt Disney turned him to a fox for 1973's animated version of the story. Not the first time Disney has courted the outlaw, as they had produced the story of Robin Hood and his merry men in 1952. Sean Connery played an older Robin in the excellent Robin and Marian in 1976. Prince of Thieves, starring Kevin Costner, arrived in 1991 and didn't do any harm to Bryan Adams' music career at all. A rival Robin Hood was released in that same year, featuring Patrick Bergin, and the genre of Robin Hood itself was sent up by Mel Brooks in 1993's Men in Tights. Russell Crowe took the lead in 2010 and Taron Egerton in 2018, as will, supposedly, Hugh Jackman at some point. For television, key amongst the many adaptations, for me at least, are The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Richard Greene, which aired from 1955 to 1959. Robin of Sherwood, starring Richard Praed and Jason Connery as different incarnations of Robin, which ran from 1984 to 1986 and is a personally cherished favourite, and Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, a children's comedy that ran from 1989 to 1994, which rewrote the legends such that it was Marian who was the hero and Robin a mere buffoon. This latter was created by Tony Robinson, he of Blackadder's Baldric fame, and starred Kate Lonergan as Marian, Wayne Morris as Robin, Danny John Jules, the cat from Red Dwarf, as Barrington, and Robinson as the Sheriff of Nottingham. It's a kids' show, so bear that in mind, but it's well worth a watch. Alongside all of that are more movies, more novels, where Robin either stars or cameos, one of the best being John Cleese in Time Bandits, or is referenced in some manner, and more TV shows, either directly representing the character or invoking him as something different, such as Robin, with a Y, a female rapper associated with a hip-hop band, The Hood. Robin Hood has deep roots, breadth of scope, and malleability of form that make the character and his exploits rich ground to build from. Inevitably, I compare Robin to Arthur, because the two of them are written large in my makeup. If you are not English, take a second to think back on those characters that you not only remember the stories of, but that were etched into the landscape around you. Arthur's Seat, Robin Hood's Well, Merlin's Tandoori. No, I'm not joking on that one. For me, not only do their stories inhabit the fabric of my being, but so far ingrained are they that I cannot imagine what it would be like otherwise. A world without them both would be a poorer world for me. But they are hardly equitable figures. On the one hand, we have Arthur, a mere squire made king by drawing a sword from a stone or anvil, and by the whims of sorceries and watery tarts, forger of a European empire that never existed, defeater of Saxons for a while, tragic figure of fate, so entwined with Britain that his passing leaves it a lesser place. On the other hand, we have a possible noble turned outlaw, or yeoman turned outlaw, or someone that was just an outlaw from birth, rebelling against king's rules in order to survive, robbing to help those around him do the same. He is never betrayed by Marian in the same way that Guinevere betrays Arthur. And neither do I see Robin's death as tragic as Arthur's. Arthur is killed facing his son born from incest and his witch sister, fatally facing layers of tragedy to the bitter end. Robin, on the other hand, lives a long, for a medieval time, life, full of adventure and romance, finally ending after a successful showdown against his ultimate nemesis to pass into the arms of his long-standing best friend. Robin is born in more difficult circumstances and makes a success out of it. Arthur is given the keys to the kingdom, and while forging a shining example at the zenith of his career, loses everything to tragedy. In many ways, Robin and Arthur show two sides of English nature. On the one hand, we aspire to greatness. We had an empire upon which the sun never set. Our language is a primary choice for international communications and trade. Our ideas regarding democracy have informed many governments across the world. But the key there is had. We had this. We did that. We have had our round table. And now face the Mordred of that which we have wrought. Our global legacy has some high points, but many lows. But we also have had a fighting spirit and rebelliousness that, despite the odds laid against us, makes us fight back. For a good chunk of the world wars, both of them, we stood virtually alone, particularly during the early wars of World War II. Other than the member nations of the Empire. Fortress Britain. While we didn't invent punk, we certainly made it edgier and more politically aware, taking its rebellious attitudes to another level. We collectively have ingrained a sense of fairness that's seen more than one British government fall after attempting to take more than its due. We celebrate rogues and thieves and pirates and smugglers, and that is our Robin Hood side. We English are a strange breed, but the heart of it beats a heady cocktail of both Arthur and Hood. In a companion video to this piece, I'll explore Robin Hood in gaming, how he has influenced certain aspects of some games, and what materials have appeared over the years to facilitate portrayal of Hood-like figures or Sherwood-esque settings. So until that one, fare thee well always, and keep one arrow nocked should the sheriff come to call.